Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Welcome once again to our monthly research seminar. Alhamdulillah, it's nice to see our faculty, students and new guests as well. Everyone's welcome. This month, alhamdulillah, we've got Dr. Chowdhury, alhamdulillah, and mashallah, he received his PhD from SOAS. He's active in a wide range of Islamic studies topics, including tasawwuf studies, including issues in fiqh and also theology, kalam and so on. And a colleague and friend of many of the people in the college as well. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome him to present his topic.
Okay, jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah al-ali al-kabir. أكرم الإنسان بالعقل وحثه على تفكير فسبحانه يخلق من يشاء وهو على كل شيء قدير وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا وحبيبنا مولانا محمد عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد وعلى أصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. I want to thank Dr. Harvey for inviting me down at CIRE, and I hear, alhamdulillah, this has got a wonderful vision and an aim. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give it tawfiq, give tawfiq to all the idariyeen, to give it mazid, and for it to realize its aims and to accomplish its objectives. Now I've got a tall order today to try and make metaphysics interesting. So I want to try and do that in about half an hour maybe, or probably more than that. But let me just try and sort of frame my own interest very quickly into this area. My passion has always been, it still remains, usul al-fiqh and fiqh. But taking a little decade detour from that, I came back to philosophical theology. I found that more and more, I found it sort of amongst the student community, amongst the Muslims in general, the attack was intellectual on Muslims, on Islam. We had a lot of creative thinkers in the community coming up with sort of novel intellectual ways to dealing with modernity, post-modernity, all the issues that currently we're facing now. And that inevitably meant sort of dealing with theology and philosophy. Even when I was in Egypt, a lot of people were emailing me and saying, how do we answer this question, and what if this and that? And they were all related to logic, metaphysics and things like that. But so I started my MA on looking at arguments, logic and arguments, especially in the Quran, and I've always been sort of fascinated by the Jadl al-Quran, and so that led me inevitably to read Ghazali, and I was looking at things like al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, the just balance. He wrote a little risala. I was looking at Imam Najmuddin al-Tufi, whose sort of his notoriety actually was in usul because of his doctrine of maslahah, and how that was an overriding principle. But not very many people know he wrote a book on argumentation, on jadal. Alam al-Jadal fi ilm al-Jadal, and it's a superb book. Up until now, I don't know, not many people have sort of been looking at it, and I think it's worth having a look at for anyone who's thinking about doing a master's thesis or a PhD. I've done some studies on it which I hope to get published on it. But that aside, I began more and more looking at logic, especially sort of Ghazali's formulation of logic and the importance of logic, how he sees it as paradigmatic. So for him, logic, as I see it, is normative, i.e. we ought to think in a logical way. Why ought we to think in a logical way? Because God thinks in a logical way. How do we know that? Well, because they're embedded everywhere in the Quran. So I remember on my MA thesis, I didn't really take up the metaphysical side, but it's always been there. And then I was interested in looking at the nature then. If logic is paradigmatic, i.e. the way Allah is supposed to think, and He told us to think in this way, and His Anbiya, His interlocutors, use logical arguments, then what's the metaphysical nature then of logic? What's its nature? How are we going to account for it? What is it? Is it an abstract thing? Is it something that's just a construct of the mind? Is it conventional? All of that stuff led me to dipping back into analytic philosophy of 20th century, where philosophers talked about the nature of necessity from Frege, until now. What is necessity? What is truth? Things like that. So that kind of language and metaphysics I started looking into, and I think, all right, I want to delve a bit deeper to see if there's anything in our tradition that I can sort of use as a precedence to try and bridge together contemporary analytic philosophy and classical or medieval metaphysics. So I'm doing some of that at the moment, dabbling in some of that, and so I'm trying to bring some of that together in a coherent way. I haven't been able to do that, so if I'm not coherent today, I do apologise. Yeah, but it's funny if you study tasawwuf, especially later tasawwuf. I did classical tasawwuf. My PhD was on an early Sufi author. You go from the theosophical to the metaphysical, so it's not really much of a jump for a lot of people. So I don't really see that I'm really going very far. I'm not really straying very far. Metaphysics and theosophy, they do overlap. What I want to talk about today really is one sort of exciting area of philosophical theology, and that is God and abstract objects. Now I want to sort of try and I want to see, right, why should we care about this topic, I guess is one way to put it. So put it bluntly, who cares about God and abstract objects? So then one way to frame it, I thought, was to use the hadith, which is obviously it's a longer hadith than the Sahih, but that Allah was and nothing was with him. كان الله ولم يكن شيء غيره ومعه وقبله. You got different riwayat. So Allah was, there wasn't anything with him. There wasn't anything with him. Now, if we're going to take a sort of logical, if we're going to sort of make this metaphysically significant, this hadith, if we're going to make it metaphysically significant, we want to talk about whether the negation whether the scope of the negation is absolute. So when nothing was with Allah, Jalla wa Ala, does that include not only concrete objects that are supposed to be in space-time, spatial, temporal, things like that, does that also include entities that are abstract, non-spatial, temporal? On a normal reading on quantification logic, you just say, that all variables, your quantification extends to all variables. You're going to say everything, absolutely everything is negated. Absolutely every kind of entity is negated. Now, if we don't take an absolute negation, then we may have to admit that there were some kind of objects alongside, other than existent with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these kind of objects that are supposed to be non-spatio-temporal, eternal, uncreated, these kind of objects philosophers call abstract objects. Abstract objects are supposed to be necessary, uncreated, immaterial, and they're supposed to be what we would say inert. They don't do anything. They don't have any causal efficacy. They don't interact with anything. So if we've got these kind of entities, and we're going to admit them as being possible, then we're in a bit of trouble. We're in a bit of trouble so far as that goes. And in contemporary philosophy, this doctrine that Allah alone exists and subsists by himself, the phrase we use is al-qiyam bi nafsihi, al-qa'im bi nafsihi, and there are obviously other similar phrases that you find in theology and in philosophy. You find this phrase in Al-Farabi, for example, that Allah is qa'im bi nafsihi. He subsists purely by the mere fact of his own existence. He doesn't rely on anything else for him to exist. And that's called the doctrine of aseity. Ase from the Latin. So not only is the doctrine of aseity affirmed in classical theism, including Islamic theism, Islamic theology, but the doctrine of divine sovereignty. That means that Allah has power over everything. He has the power to create anything he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. There is nothing that doesn't fall under his irresistible, majestic power. So we have aseity, the fact that Allah exists by himself and subsists by himself without relying on anyone or anything, and the fact that he's sovereign. Nothing can thwart his power or the scope of his power. So we've got these two issues, but if we admit abstract objects, then we're going to be contradicting this doctrine of aseity or qiyam bi nafsihi and the doctrine of divine sovereignty, because we're going to have to posit entities that exist alongside Allah. This also has an impact on another majority held normative doctrine, and that's creation out of nothing, The creatio ex nihilo. So what are we going to do with that? If there are objects that exist alongside Allah, these kind of abstract objects, what's going to happen to the doctrine of creation from nothing? There's going to be pre-existent entities alongside Allah. They could be created by Allah, but they're as we'll come to and look at some solutions. But if they exist and were uncreated, or if they exist alongside, or if they're eternal, then we're going to have some problems with the doctrine of creation out of nothing. So we've got some conundrums here. So should we even care about abstract objects? What are these things that are abstract objects? Well, any of you may have read some sort of Greek philosophy or even medieval philosophy. You know that there's a number of arguments why we should believe, or we have to believe in abstract objects. Things like numbers, concepts, properties, equalities. In mathematics as well, we have sets. In logic, we have possible worlds, laws of logic and things like that. How do we account for these things? Do they really exist, or are we just using them as sort of make-believe? So when we're talking about numbers, are we just talking as though it doesn't exist, but we're just sort of playing make-believe? Or do we actually believe that when we say the number 2, there is an abstract object called the number 2 that we're referring to? Otherwise our referring to that thing will be empty. When we say lots of different objects are red, then they all share in the quality of the property of redness. Surely we must admit that there must be some entity that sort of, that sort of all that they share in the quality of redness. So redness is exemplified in lots of different objects. In the medieval textbooks you find, we've read Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, whoever, they talked about universals. So the humanity. So all of us are human beings, we share in the essence of humanity. So is humanity an abstract object that exists out there? Such that you and I, all of us in this room, we share in that property, in that quality. If we don't, if it doesn't exist, then what is it then? Are we just using it in a fictional way? So these kind of debates. The other reason why abstract objects are posited, and this is more of a sort of contemporary argument used in philosophy of mathematics, is that normally we shouldn't believe in things that we don't have to believe in. Sounds reasonable, right? Normally we don't want to believe in something that we don't have to believe in. But things like numbers, properties, sets, these are necessary and indispensable for us to do science properly and mathematics properly. We have to admit that these things exist in order for our discourse to be meaningful, in order for science to be meaningful. Therefore, for that reason, we ought to believe in such objects as numbers and sets and logic and things like that. They're clearly not physical things, they're clearly abstract things. You might be wondering, I don't care. What's it got to do with me? Alright, but let me frame it in this way within the Islamic tradition. Here's 2 examples for you to think about. Okay, when Allah uses terms like al-qist, al-haq, al-adl, are these empty words? Or do they refer to real things? So Allah says, وَأَقِيمُ الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ. Oh yeah, don't worry, we don't really have to worry about it. Qist is just an empty word, Allah just used it as a word. We should just take some moral lesson from it and that's about it. Or is there such a thing as qist? Fairness and balance, justice. When we say al-haq, truth, are we saying that this is just an empty word? Truth doesn't refer to anything? So if there are no referents, if there's nothing that these words refer to, they're just empty, then what we're in effect saying is the Quran is just one big 6,500 odd verses of empty words. They don't really, the things that it refers to don't really exist because they're abstract things. Many people aren't prepared to accept that. They want the words to be meaningful, but yet they don't want it to be sort of empty. The reference, they don't want it to be empty. They want the words to be meaningful. Not just meaningful in a pragmatic sense, but in an existential sense. Alright, there's one example. Let's take another example. I'jaz al-Quran. The Quran being miraculous. Okay, right, so let's say the Quran, according to one theory, let's say the theory of Nazm, let's say Imam al-Jurjani's account, sort of structuralist account, or any other account that takes form into consideration. Okay, i'jaz on this account, the Quran is argued to be inimitable, matchless, unique, because of the way the lexical items, the words, the variables are configured. The way they're configured, one, that give rise to its communicative value, the semantic value, i.e. the meaning that it generates, linguistic value, and lots of other things. But the words are configured according to a prearranged structure. That structure isn't something physical. Is it physical? Is form physical? Is structure physical? Definitely not. The variables are organized by a speaker. In this case, of course, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's expressed according to how the divine mind has configured these lexical items, these words, in the way that He did, in the optimal way that it is, to produce maximal meaning, effect, style, etc., etc. It can't be the word singly itself that's mu'jiz. No one believes that. Otherwise, it becomes what? You can now do, you can match it. So if I just said the word dhalika is inimitable, someone says, oh, is that the only thing that makes a Quran? All right, here's dhalika, here you go, I've matched the miracle. Those theorists never said that. They said it's the composition, the form, the structure, the way the words are configured to produce meaning is what makes the Quran mu'jiz. Now the meaning is configured according to an arrangement thought out by an author. So Allah arranged it according to His divine wisdom and knowledge, how He wanted each word to be configured in a way for the purposes that He configured them. Now the basis on which He configured them is something immaterial. It's abstract. If we ask someone to point to where is the structure or form of the surah, where are you going to point to? There isn't a physical thing to point to. It's not a building. It's something that's abstract. So that might be two arguments for us for why abstract objects, the discussion about abstract objects, has some impact on Muslim theology. So you could be, it's called in the literature, you could be an realist. You could say, well, these things don't really exist. What you talk about, in another language world, someone else can talk about it. For them that's true, for you that's true. Everyone just gets along, there's no objective truth. But that's a bit problematic. That kind of conventionalism. You get that in Carnap, Rudolf Carnap, you get that conventionalism, which he called linguistic frameworks. He goes, you know what, there's no objective truth. You can't talk about objective truth. You can't talk about metaphysics. You can't talk about ethics. You can't talk about aesthetics, things that are beautiful, right and wrong. You can't talk about things like this. That's just, you're just talking within a linguistic framework. For your linguistic framework, yeah, it makes sense. In another linguistic framework, it doesn't make sense to me. Let's all be happy with a conventionalism. Now, religiously, that's a bit problematic, right? Especially for within Islamic theology, because we are making some absolute claims about reality. For one, we're saying that Allah exists. That's a demarcator. That claim itself, is the dividing line. We're saying that there can be objective truth. There can be certain claims that are true irregardless of what people think or how they feel. So things like that. So inevitably there is some spillage into our theology. And believe it or not, Muslim philosophers and theologians talked about, these kind of things, maybe not in the way that I'm framing it, but nevertheless they talked about universals. Right, so what can we do? So another example, I guess we could do, and this is quite a hot debate, is whether whether right and wrong. How do we ground right and wrong if we believe in a God? Is Allah beholden to a standard external to Himself, in virtue of which He decides something is right and wrong? Or is right and wrong grounded in the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like voluntarists believe? Most of the Ash'ari believe that divine commandments entailed right and wrong. They weren't ethical, what we call ethical realists. They didn't believe that there were moral facts out there in the world where you can pick out. So part of the structure of the world, the ontology of the world, one of the furniture of ontology, one of the aspects of ontology are not moral facts. Moral facts are not embedded in actions. There's no property. You can say something is tall, red, heavy, light. You can say these kind of things about objects and things, but what you cannot say, there is no sensible quality in an object or a thing that tells you whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. Others say, well, hang on, no. Right and wrong, torturing someone is just wrong. I get a blowtorch and I blowtorch someone, make them into fried chicken. That's just wrong. Doesn't matter in what religion, where you come from. That's just got to be wrong. And it's just, I can't conceive of God allowing that to happen. Now, that might entail there being a standard in virtue of which the divine, is now sorting out what is right, what is wrong, deciding what is wrong. That becomes the mi'yar. Others might ground it within the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But hikmah is a property. Is a property. It's not a material thing, it's an immaterial thing. So, right and wrong grounded in something immaterial. For some people, it may be the very character of Allah. Like Ibn Rushd's argument was, the very person, the kind of person or being that Allah is, that is what grounds that is what grounds our morality, right and wrong. The Mu'tazila were clearly people who affirmed an objective moral standard, that even the human plane of morality and the divine plane of morality was the same. Now obviously the Ash'ari lambasted that. They was like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to go down that route. But that's another reason why abstract objects comes into the debate. What are these standards of morality? So what can be some of the possible solutions or ways of answering or grasping this debate between this relationship between God and abstract objects within the Islamic tradition? I'll propose some. I'm going to propose some. I've got a draft paper on this, so if anyone's interested, I can always email it after, or give it to Dr. Harvey and then he can post it, or if anyone's interested, I can leave my email and then you can have a read of it. Okay, here are some ways to deal with God and abstract objects, these objects that are supposed to be immaterial, effete, eternal, uncreated, and so on. You got something called absolute creationism. So, okay, if I were to just divide it up, okay, you got abstract objects, you got those we call realists. They believe abstract objects actually exist. That's part of their ontology. Imagine you have a chest drawer, call that your ontology drawer. What things are you going to put in there that you believe, that you actually commit to, that you think is real? So just as real as this table. Yeah? So you open your ontology chest drawer and you find in there abstract objects. If you believe in abstract objects, you're a realist. If you don't believe in abstract objects, you're a nominalist or an anti-realist. Yeah? So if you believe in abstract objects, so you're that branch, you're the realist branch, what are some ways you can account for the relation between God and abstract objects? One way you could say, right, these abstract objects that I believe in, that I think are real, one way I can account for it is that Allah created them, God created them. They're from the direct, causal, creative action of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's called absolute creationism. Abstract objects exist, but you know what? God created them. And if God created them, there's no problem. We've solved the qiyam bi nafsihi problem, and we've solved the creation ex nihilo problem. Another way you can look at it is what's known as theistic activism. This is one formulation. I believe this was Ibn Taymiyyah's view. This is my reading. I've discussed it briefly with Dr. Harvey before and some others. I believe Ibn Taymiyyah was a theistic activist. And what this view says is that abstract objects like universals, one thing that applies to many things, are actually uncreated, but but the divine attributes plays the role. So anwa' and ajnas, universal genus of things, genus and species, i.e. those things that can refer to many different things, the divine attributes plays that role. So Allah's attributes are like these kind of abstract entities that sort of emerge out of the divine essence. And then these divine attributes are exemplified in creation in particulars. So think of them like beaming into different particulars. You know, there's a long analysis on that. I believe this is my reading at the moment of this is like Ibn Taymiyyah's kind of view. Allah's attributes emerge, and he calls it huduth. They weren't created. They kind of sort of. The analogy I can only think of is like, you know, the sun but consuming its energy, you know, within itself. Like that, the divine attributes emerge out of the essence itself. Then they're exemplified in creation continuously. That kind of activism within the divine essence, that kind of fusion that's going on. Yeah, it's a lame analogy with the sun and the heat being considered, helium and all that consumption within its own sort of structure. That's the only analogy I can think of off the top of my head at the moment. You can take that. So abstract objects are something that they just are part of the divine character or being itself. That's called theistic activism. You can take the common route that was taken by the medieval scholastics, not so much in the Islamic world necessarily, but within the Christian scholastic world, is that these abstract objects, you know what they are? They're just divine thoughts. So we're not going to believe in this Plato's wonderful heaven of abstract objects, the Platonic horde. You know what we're going to do? We're going to relocate the horde into the divine mind. So what abstract objects are? They're just thoughts of the divine. And that's called divine conceptualism. Divine conceptualism. So they're not really things that are generated or created, but they're part of the divine intellective activity. Numbers, parts of the thoughts of God. Propositions. Not sentences, but propositions. The things that sentences refer to. Again, sort of expressions of the divine intellectual activity. Laws of logic. They're the ways that the divine thinks. So these are possible answers if you're a realist, i.e. you actually believe in abstract objects. What if you're not? What if you're an anti-realist? What if you're a nominalist? Yeah. The word nominalism is actually quite problematic in Islamic theology because it's associated with people who deny, mu'attila, people who deny the divine attributes. The whole Mu'tazila Ash'ari discussion. I don't want to go down, I don't want to open that can of worms at the moment, but it has that connotation. You're nominalist, what, you deny the divine attribute, you don't take them literally. That kind of things. Don't call it nominalism, you can call it anti-realism. Yeah, it might be sort of a good juxtaposition with realism. So what are some possible ways we can explain abstract objects on an anti-realist view? Well, one way we could say is, well, you know, abstract objects, they don't exist. All these theories have one thing in common. They don't believe that abstract objects exist. Right, so how do we account for using numbers, propositions, sets, possible worlds, laws of logic? How do we... Well, on one account, fictionalism, that says, and it's taken from literary theory as well and in art. Well, one way we can explain it is by saying, when we use words like numbers, when we use things that refer to immaterial things, properties, classes, sets, they're not really true, we're just using them, but they don't really exist. It's as if like, we were telling a story, or using a metaphor. They're fictional, it's as if I were to, if I were to say Gandalf had a cup of tea or something, yeah? Now Gandalf don't really exist, does he? For most of us, yeah? So it's like that, Gandalf is a fictional character, it doesn't exist. Well, in the same way, abstract objects exist like that as well. That's called fictionalism. Abstract objects are not really true. They're about as true as Gandalf, or Pegasus, or Zeus, or anyone else. So, that's one. Similar to fictionalism is figuralism, Stephen Yablow's one. These are all taken from philosophy and mathematics, by the way, yeah? This whole debate comes from the philosophy of mathematics. For those of you who perhaps studied philosophy of mathematics, you'll be very familiar, with these arguments, especially, regarding Quine, Hilary Putnam and W.V.O. Quine and the indispensability argument, things like that. Okay, figuralism says when we talk about abstract objects, everything that we've been talking about, it's metaphorical. It literally is metaphorical. Very, very similar overlap with fictionalism. It's all metaphor talk. So when we say, I'll die for a cup of tea, that's a figure of speech, yeah? That's how we're using numbers, sets, laws of logic, or when we're referring to them, that is, in language. What we're doing is we're just talking metaphorically. And in fact, the norm is metaphor in language, according to some of these theories. And then the exception is literalism. Then there's pretense theory. When we talk about abstract objects, we're just talking about make-believe. It's a bit like how we talk with children. We talk about Santa Claus, we're just using a fictional language, a make-believe language. So when we're talking about numbers, when we're doing equations, when we're doing logical, assessing logical formulas or putting things in logical notations, when we're talking about possible worlds, when we're talking about sets, when we're talking about properties, what we're really doing is we're imagining them to be true, but they're not really true. They're make-believe. We've just conjured up a make-believe language so we can all talk to each other in a make-believe way. It's a fairy tale language. So there's that. So these are some of the sort of anti-realist views that are available for people who actually don't believe any kind of abstract object exists. So what I was trying to do then in the paper and sort of some of my research is trying to see then how, from our theology, where we would sit on the line, or on the fence, as it were, on what side of the line we may want to commit to, we may not. Whether we do or not, no position really no position comes free from any sort of metaphysical problems and counter problems. No solution in metaphysics is ever easy. Anyone who studied philosophy or even theology. The other view that I didn't put here, but I guess is a view, is what we would call imminent realism. And this is what we get a lot in Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, we get that a lot in Islamic philosophy. What that says is that things like abstract objects don't really exist. Things like redness, like colour, qualities, they only exist with the object in which they come, in which they're paired with. That's very Aristotelian. Because Aristotle didn't accept Plato's theory of forms, that there were these abstract ideas out there that exist separate of anyone. They were eternal, uncreated, like a horde, a host. Aristotle didn't believe that. He said, no, that's got a lot of problems with it. Why don't we just say that the quality itself appears with the object itself? They call that imminent realism. The quality itself is immanent in the object. It comes with the object. It's sometimes known as moderate realism. And then your mind just abstracts the quality. Your mind just does the job of pulling out the quality from the object. That's all that's happening. So that's a kind of imminent realism combined with a kind of abstractionism. So that seems to be the Ibn Sina position, this kind of moderate realism. Like I said, you also get it in Farabi. You seem to get it in some of our traditional theology as well, that there are no such thing as essences like humanity. What the mind does is the mind abstracts the quality of humanity. The mind does the job, it abstracts it. And so therefore it's conceptual, it's lodged in the mind, but it has no real existence out there. That seems to be some of the position adopted by the Ash'ari and Maturidiyya generally. Some of the Mu'tazila as well. But then it gets tricky for them as well, like I said, because they seem to be, ethical realists. They seem to believe that there are moral facts out there in the world. I know there's nuances. It depends on which account of the Mu'tazila we take, because their idea of wajh when it comes to ethics is different. So Yeah, so this is one way of framing the problem. Going back originally then, how do we understand the negation? If you're a nominalist, then you would negate, the negation is absolute. That includes abstract entities and concrete entities or concrete objects. If you're a Platonist, a realist, you're going to have to qualify that. You're going to have to qualify it. And how you qualify it depends on what metaphysical posturing you take. What metaphysical account you're going to give then of these abstract objects that you believe to be real. You could take the position then, yeah, I don't really have to worry, I don't believe abstract objects exist, it's just language make-believe. But as we said, then there's, then we have to then say the kind of theology talk that we're doing, I'll wrap up here, the kind of theology talk that we're doing, our references are all empty. Our references are all empty. It's just a make-believe we're doing. So when Anbiya came with these words and terms, it was just really metaphorical. It was just really metaphorical. They weren't really referring to anything real out there in the world. That was just a language that we're using for some pragmatic purposes or something like that. So each has its own problems metaphysically. People don't want to go there. That's why I said nominalism is a very sort of ugly word in theology. What are you saying when Allah refers to himself as having these attributes, what, they don't really exist? Are you just saying it's just a word we're using that has an empty reference? Surely we don't want to say that. Surely you don't want to negate what Allah is saying of himself and so on and so on. Then we get into the whole spiral of, whether you deny divine attributes or not. So, and yet you don't want the multiplicity of entities within the divine essence. Why? Because then that goes against the doctrine of divine simplicity, right? The Mu'tazila tried to avoid that, Ash'ari tried to avoid it. Everyone tried to avoid multiplicity in the divine essence. You don't want coexisting entities with the divine. You want the divine essence to be subsistent by itself. So I'll throw those kind of worms out there, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. If we can have question discussion, I don't really mind. Yeah. Barakallahu feekum. Afwan.
So we've got plenty of time for discussion, questions, clarifications and so on. Please raise your hand if there's anything you want to ask or any point you want to make. I know often when you first have the end of a talk, people are just gathering there.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, no, true.
And especially when it's like this. So I'm going to push you on a question to start off with while people can think of theirs. So you mentioned a lot of these different viewpoints, and I noticed you were very, very careful to avoid sort of backing any one of them. So would you say that is there a particular viewpoint that you would like to put out there as your preferred solution to the problem that you've posed? Or at least a solution you may want, a stance you may think about taking, and why that would be your kind of option?
For me, I want to keep my ontological chest drawer, as it were, as streamlined as possible. I don't want to believe in things as being real unless I have to commit to that. So I want to keep my metaphysical sort of meat lean. Yeah, I want to keep my ontology lean. And at the moment, I'm sort of siding generally with philosophers who tend to feel that when I refer to objects that are abstract, they're not really referring to the objects themselves. Because I feel my ontology just gets overcrowded now. I have to then, if I say things like there's a hole in my shirt, am I committed to now a thing called a hole? Or if I make references to days, weeks, Wednesday was a great day, Tuesday was a great day, am I committed to something like Wednesday? How do I, what I'm trying to work out is where do I draw the line between what I can take into my ontology when it comes to abstract? So at the moment I tend to think I'm more of an anti-realist camp rather than a realist camp. I don't want to make the ascent to metaphysics from semantics. I don't want to have to sort of make my language take me to the metaphysical realm. I want to work out something where I don't have to make that ascent, from language to metaphysics. So at the moment I'm toying with these ideas. I didn't add on one at the bottom there, neo-Menongianism. Alexius Menon's idea, he believed that non-existent things exist. And I know students of Islamic studies would know al-ma'doom shay, the non-existent is a thing. Yeah. So maybe a kind of neo-Menongianism maybe could be possibly added on there as well. His thought has exploded in the last 10 years. Number of works have sort of gone back to Menon, and then there's a movement called neo-Menongianism. That what the logic behind it is this, and just bear with me a bit. I know if you feel that you want to switch off here, fair enough. But in logic, we got something called the existential quantifier, the backwards E. You may have seen that for anyone who's done logic. So we've got the backwards E, and that's called the existential quantifier. When you say there is something, هناك شيء, there is something, yeah, or you use the word, موجود, yeah, exist. What you're referring to in classical logic, when you say there is something, you're committed to that object actually existing. Your existential reference, you have to make an ontological commitment when you use the existential quantifier. That's classical logic. That's Aristotelian, that's Avicennan, Ghazalian, all the way until recent times. So when I say there are properties, or there are propositions, I'm committed to the existential quantifier ranges over that variable. It applies to that variable. So I'm actually making a commitment. The symbol represents my actual ontological commitment to that thing. Now what these logicians and philosophers are saying is that we don't want to make the existential quantifier, i.e. when I make existential claims, we don't want to make it ontologically heavyweight. We don't want to make it ontologically heavyweight. We don't want to commit to something when we use the existential quantifier in that way. So when I say there is, I don't want to automatically make a commitment to that object. If I want to, I will give some kind of contextual indication or qara'in to say that I believe in it. I might use a modifier like an emphatic particle. Like say, I believe in that thing. That's a modifier, that's an emphatic. That thing in italics. Then I can say, yeah, all right, I believe in that thing exists. But classical logic, the assumption was you have to have an ontological commitment. You have to commit to the things that you say exist. But these philosophers, they want to pare down the force and the power of that existential quantifier. They want to pare down what you are committed to when you use that quantifier. So I like that. I'm more drawn to that kind of idea. Otherwise, my ontological chest drawer is going to be huge. It's going to be overflowing. And I want to sort of shave it down with Occam's razor, as it were. So yeah, I tend to be in the anti-realist. I tend to incline towards that at the moment.
Yeah. Question or comment here?
Yeah, I asked a question. Do you think there's been a general philosophical shift towards anti-realism and imminent realism? And do you feel that has any kind of causal relationship with the philosophical shift towards atheism?
Do you think? Are you asking whether do the two correlate? I mean, what I will say is this: there is a number of experts within our community, Muslims, who are working on these kind of models and whether they can sit comfortably with theology. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be because of the connotation. Yeah. So if we take this anti-realism as a starting point, then what are we going to do with religious claims? We're taking a kind of deflationary attitude to religious claims. We're paring down metaphysics, and that's dangerous, especially in theology, where it's metaphysically thick. Yeah. So I'm aware of that problem. But I would say I think Platonism, theological Platonism, is strong. Is strong. We obviously had a Neoplatonic tradition that was very, very strong. and it took a revival in the Ishraqi tradition, and those who know Shi'i theology and later sort of philosophical theology will be better placed to make those evaluations. I think Platonism in philosophical circles and theological circles is still very strong, because divine conceptualism, remember, which seems to be quite popular amongst a lot of theologians, it still believes in abstract objects. It just relocates it in the divine mind. That's all. But they still believe abstract objects exist. So the realists, they just move it around. They move it into the mind of God. Some people move it into the person of God. Some people into the divine, the actual, the essential activity with the divine essence. And I believe that was Ibn Taymiyyah's view. So they're still, you know, I don't know if there seems to be, in 20th century, there was a correlation between this kind of anti-realism and atheism. You got that in logical positivism, the view that, you know, all ethical, aesthetic, metaphysical claims, they're just nonsensical. You can never adjudicate them. You can't say what's right, what's wrong. In fact, we shouldn't even bother asking about these questions. That was the very hardcore positivism. So yeah, there is a marriage between the two. I guess there were in the 20s onwards. And so a lot of people want to stay clear because of that connotation. I don't know is the answer about whether Platonism, whether anti-realism is growing, but nominalism. But Platonism is strong. It's strong. One other view I didn't put up there, which I addressed in the paper, is the view, you know, of Ibn Hazm. You know, Allah created everything. You know, even whatever doesn't make sense, the nonsensical. He created logic. He created everything. And that's called divine. It's called voluntarism, divine voluntarism. God made everything. He can make anything possible. What are you going to do about it? You just don't understand it. And I think this move towards dialetheism that some of our Muslim scholars in the analytic tradition are going for will probably sit well with Ibn Hazm. Now obviously people after Ibn Hazm thought, oh my God, what are you talking about? Because he said if Allah wants to take a son, he can take a son. What's your problem? He created logic. That could be one view the Muslims can take. I address it in the paper, but I didn't address it here. Allah made everything. Everything is under the divine sovereignty. He could do whatever he wants. The problem is with you and me. Why are we putting limits on the divine power? If he says he wants to take a son, he can take a son. If you want to make logical laws, if you want to uncreate logical laws, you can uncreate them. You can contravene the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluding middle, the law of identity. He can make something in one place, the same thing in two different places in the same way at the same time. And obviously the Ash'ari after him like, what are you talking about? You know, so that's an option. And I'm telling you, there is a growing sort of push towards dialetheism, the fact that contradictions can exist and things like that. So watch out, watch for that space. Reviving an Ibn Hazm view. So yeah, so for Ibn Hazm then there is no problem in the end.
Sheikh Shams at the back.
Tfaddal Maulana. Ahlan bikum.
Are there any recognized classifications for the hawa? You know, I'm assuming, so when you say properties, you're talking about hawa, right?
Anything that you can describe, the Aristotelian categories,
Yeah,
basically.
So everything abstract. Right?
Yeah.
Obviously, not all abstracts are the same.
Definitely not. I mean, they're different types.
Recognized classifications.
Are you saying our classifications are abstract objects?
No, yeah, that's what complicates it.
That's right. That's right.
I want to come to that issue, but are there any recognized classifications among philosophers, among scholars,
Yeah.
of abstract realities themselves, given that all abstract realities are not the same?
Yeah.
Something that occurs to your mind, an idea of what occurs to your mind, is not the same as the color of an object.
Yeah. So properties, things that you describe, things of something of possessing. So properties is a paradigm abstract object. Numbers are paradigm. The way to look at an abstract object is to say anything that can be multiply instantiated in multiple things at the same time. That will be an abstract object. And the medievals call that a universal.
I mean, the classic categories is
the Aristotelian,
Aristotle's 10 categories is like the absolute classic.
Yeah, classic,
structure. And that was commentated on.
For so many centuries, yeah.
And so, but obviously these days they're going into like Mengongian.
Yeah, definitely. So, so there's some paradigm abstract objects. If I haven't answered the question, let me know, Monsham. So the things that like, you know, weight, size, shape, color, mass, location, these kind of things. Things that you can predicate an object as having. These are, definitely. These are paradigmatic cases of abstract objects.
And in the realist and anti-realist debate, right? Where does concept fit?
Abstract object.
Sorry?
Abstract object.
As an abstract object.
If you believe concept is just in the mind, you're known as a psychologist. You believe in psychologism.
Are we saying concept and thought is the same thing?
Yeah, it depends how you define thought. If you define thought as a product of the intellect, then it's immaterial, non-spatial, isn't it? Like dreams.
Right, so therefore
it's abstract.
It's another abstract.
Yeah. Although some might categorize it as a concrete.
Anti-realist, therefore. How do they square their...
They don't believe in squares, remember? No, I'm joking. It's a lame joke. It's a philosopher's joke.
That's what you do.
That's right.
But how do they square the conceptual nature of the whole discussion? So when they resort to take a position of anti-realism, how do they square the fact that they have to resort to...
Referring to these things?
Yeah, they have to use an abstract in order to even think about the issue.
Are you saying that they have to use concepts in themselves?
Isn't that the ultimate, paradox, the ultimate contradiction?
You see, for them though, they're willing to take... Remember, every side will take a bullet. If you're a Platonist, if you're a realist, you believe abstract objects exist alongside God, you have to take a bullet in one respect. And anti-realists aren't saying that this is the solution that solves all the metaphysical problems. How many bullets are you willing to take? That's what it is. So the anti-realists may have to say that. Yeah, you know what? But the moment I open the door, I'm using concepts, but you know what? That's just my mind making abstractions. Can you see? And then I'm creating symbols, words or numbers in order to talk meaningfully with you so we can come to some kind of common understanding. But my mind is doing the abstraction. But what they would say is, I don't want to believe that the thing that my mind did the abstraction of, I don't want to commit to that being something real. The moment I do that, then I've come into the realist camp. So he's willing to bite the bullet that there is a paradox. And all metaphysics has a paradox. The Platonist paradox is, well, what's God going to do with all these abstract entities? What's his relation with them? You stand in relation of, abstract object. What's he doing with them? What's he doing with the abstract object of justice? Can you see? So every metaphysical position has to bite some kind of bullet of confusion or paradox, inevitably. But you're right, it just depends on when it comes to weighing what you think, the way you're willing to take the hit.
Some of the issues are only difficult if you this idea of committing to it. I think if your commitment to an ontology requires you to resolve some of those points. I mean, if you feel you have to absolutely resolve the question of what God does with his justice, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
But that's only if you have to. Why do you have to commit to resolve what does do with his justice before?
Okay, what it is that the discussion is about language. So when we use words, we normally think that when we use a word and we refer to something, we're referring to something that exists. Otherwise, our word reference, then we're not... if I say to you, right, the following words that I'm going to say, listen to me, but they don't refer to anything. They're just empty words. But I'm going to say them to you anyway. I went to the shop and had a cup of tea. You know what? Cup doesn't exist. Walk doesn't exist. I don't even exist. I'm not referring to myself in the sentence. I'm not referring to tea. I'm not referring to walk. The words don't refer to what I'm referring to in the sentence. Now, if we take that line, we're going to run into problems with religious language. Then we have to say, why is religious language an exception when it comes to reference? Why are they not empty? Or So that's one of the reasons motivating Platonists to say these objects that when I refer to something, they must exist. Otherwise, it's just meaningless, empty referring. Why don't I just not say any words? Can you see? That's what they're grappling with. Does word refer and hook onto its referent? And it spills into theological language, because we all want to say that religious language, a language from the Quran, let's just keep it simple as that the words that the words are the things that the words are referring to actually exist. If we're saying they don't exist, then we're either saying it's all fictional, it's all metaphorical, it's all pretense talk. So a form of the Quran is just divine pretense talk. A long divine text message sent to human beings that is just some kind of make-believe language that God used.
I think you could be, someone could say that you're kind of, by making this kind of dichotomy between nominalism and realism,
yeah,
and you're either one side or the other, right? You're setting up a kind of false
fair enough,
binary,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And as you said, there's a kind of middle view, which has a bit of both, this abstraction view, where it's like, okay, we abstract things, we have a mind, we're abstracting concepts, there is something real out there, but it might not be all of our concepts. But
yeah, that's Aristotelian, that's Aristotle's view,
but this is like absolutely in the mainstream of what kind of, as you said, theologians were doing, in major schools, even the Mu'tazila. You said that. So from a kind of religious, is it a problem for us point of view?
No, I'm not.
A very rich position in the middle, but it might be in contemporary philosophy. Of course, every position can be taken, and they take them all and it's a game. For Muslims, there's been a kind of, the middle path, kind of have a bit of both, and that's been, I think, it's more. Probably the most defensible view that you've mentioned in my book.
I mean, a lot of people find imminent realism, this kind of Aristotelian realism, very attractive. But then you run into the problem of, and then you have to say every particular has redness. Let's say every object has the quality of redness on it. So the question is this: imagine there were no more objects that were red in the world, in the universe. Does red still exist? On an Aristotelian imminent view, no. If you destroy all concrete objects, you would destroy colour. All objects, then there will be no more colour left. And many people Platonists obviously, would just find that very bizarre. Very bizarre. What is it that gave the concrete particular its redness? Obviously there's a whole long debate about that. But you're right, a lot of people like imminent realism. That is one option. I put it in the paper, that's one view.
I think that the very nature of a property, is that it doesn't exist on its own. It's not plug into that, right? That's the very definition.
Yeah, if you're equating properties with a'rad, if you're equating properties with a'rad.
Definition of it, so therefore it follows that if the...
On a kalam cosmology. On a kalam cosmology.
Yeah, they took that from Aristotle.
Yeah, Aristotle, that's right,
That's right, yeah. So, I mean, the alternative argument is that we're then left with this other dichotomy, possibly a false one, that either awarid don't exist. There's no such thing as properties. Or because we have to accept that when something that is when the substance is non-existent, then the arid also goes. So
absolutely.
Therefore, if that red banner disappears or no longer exists, or nothing red exists, red no longer exists. Just because we refuse to accept that. Right, we have to now entertain the possibility that red has its own independent existence.
You're right. That was the Avicenna and Farabian.
Dichotomies are entirely.
Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina being Aristotelian, obviously Al-Farabi both of them being Neoplatonic as well. That was some of the things. There's a long discussion about realism and sort of Platonism, how it plays out in medieval Islamic philosophy.
But logic's harder, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to come to that paradigm case of the laws of logic.
Like the Asharis, what I find interesting about the Ashari position is they kind of say that God can do anything, but he can't contradict himself.
Yeah, except his only constraints are logical constraints.
But they still have to account for logic.
Yeah, absolutely. So
you Asharis struggle to account for logic, to be honest.
So what do you do with the laws of logic? You're saying that the scope of divine omnipotence doesn't extend to mustahilat. It doesn't extend to impossibilities, right? The divine qudra لا تتعلق مع المستحيلات. It doesn't connect to impossibilities. Why? Because they're logically impossible. Yeah, so Allah can't fluff himself out of existence. Yeah, but on a kind of Ibn Hazm view, You just can't understand it. Your mind went, pfft. It's just, so, well, that shouted us like, whoa, no. There are logical limits to divine omnipotence, otherwise we're going to land into contradictions, self-contradictions. So, but what do you do? That's a limit, a constraint now. We're using logic, the laws of logic to constrain. You're using a conceptual, you're ring-fencing divine omnipotence with something conceptual. Now, I don't want to take up the whole sort of Platonism and realism debate because that's it's very, very detailed, yeah? But both sides do have their views about it. Imminent realist, seems to be very attractive, Aristotelian. It was a scholastic view, actually, in the Christian world as well. But what do you do with things like qist, adl, haqq? What do you do with these terms? You then have to say they don't really refer to real things, especially if they're divine names. They're empty references. Now then you're a nominalist if you say that. And now you become a bandit now.
They're conceptual.
Yeah, but does it have a reality? Has a madlul, that's fine, but does the madlul have a referent?
All terms that require definition. And this is my problem generally with philosophy. So the moment you say it has to have a reality, you have to, in order to deal with that, you have to kind of have a very, very clear definition of what you mean.
That's right.
By the real.
Okay, so what are we doing with these words then when we're using them?
Right. So if by real you mean existing, right?
If that has being, yeah.
Yes. So if by real you mean existing, then that's very, very real to referring to real as meaning physical.
But it doesn't have to be physical, Monasham. Yeah, something real doesn't have to just be physical. Physical just means extended in space.
And it just seems to me that this is just an extension of the whole kind of empirical issue that's been brought up by the rise of science. It's just another thing that seems to philosophically kind of lean towards favouring the empirical versus against the metaphysical, and therefore, it's just another. It's just an attempt to add to the arsenal against religion. Fundamentally, it appears to me that there is a kind of refusal to engage with terms. So people throw about words like real and so on and so forth, but refuse to
define those terms.
Refuse to engage what exactly they mean by real.
Well, absolutely. I mean that.
So if real is anything anything that we see or feel or conceive of, then it's real, right? So
yeah, but your dreams are just as real as this table, right? That's not extended in space.
Sorry?
Your dreams, like dreams, thoughts, they're just as real as this table, right?
Well, why do we have to? Why does a dream have to be compared to a table? Why can't a dream be compared to?
But is it real or not?
Conceptual reality.
But no, but what do you mean? Does it have?
Conceptual realities are real, right? Right. How real it is. Not all things are equally real.
But now you're going into gradations of ontology. Now the mutakallimun didn't.
That's precisely the problem.
Didn't accept that.
The first question to you was.
That's Neoplatonic, by the way.
Recognized classifications.
Huh?
Are there recognized classifications?
No, it's all up for grabs. Yeah, but that's later. That's Shirazi. That's Ishraqi stuff. The hierarchy of ontology, hierarchies of being. The Mutakallimun looked at that and went, I could sniff a bit of Plato here. Nah, I'm not. I'm Plotinus. I will stay away from it.
These hierarchies, like,
yeah.
Like 20 years ago.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Remember that. But my vague recollection of them is that they were extremely vague. It wasn't really they weren't really clearly defined classifications, and fundamentally that's the problem. So, it favours modern philosophy.
You're right. You're right. That's why I said the anti-realist view. I think one of the sisters asked here that this kind of views. Yes, it comes from a tradition, a logical movement that was very anti-religion, anti-metaphysics, anti-ethics. That's true. That's, in the logical positivist, the conventionalism view, yeah? The verification. But that collapsed. Verification has collapsed. But the reason why I posited them out there, divorced of the movement that it came from, right, is just for those who don't want to get into a heavyweight ring of metaphysics. They don't want to just believe anything. That's just whatever we say, we have to believe in whatever we refer to. So I was just saying that these are possible for the Muslim, to use. It's got some precedence in our tradition. That's all. But you're right. I mean, that has been used as to service the attack against religion. The logical, the reviving that kind of hard empiricism. But
That's probably the only reason why Muslims didn't engage.
it could be one of the
Why we have to have seminars like this?
Oh, inshallah. I mean, you lot are doing the stuff, mashallah.
But okay, so then in that case, and this is the last thing I'm going to say because other people need to speak. So in that case, what's the way forward for Muslims? Because we're interested in answers. We're not interested in just asking questions.
Yeah.
Right? Because we come from a tradition where, to a certain extent, the answers are provided for us, and therefore we seek to put, the various knowns together to try to establish another known, rather than just to create more and more unknowns. I think that's our tradition. Our tradition is a tradition of hukm. It's a tradition of
absolutely.
We try to answer when we engage with, when we conceptualize about things. It is to arrive at some sort of clear answer.
I mean,
given that so much of this is, it's just by design. It's just left out.
Yeah.
Let's just confuse the hell out of it.
I mean, for me, one way to start, like with all things, is what are my fundamental commitments? My fundamental commitments are Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is independent of anyone and anything and everything. Everything other than Allah is dependent on Allah. That's one of my foundational. The other thing is that, again, it goes back to the thing I mentioned right at the beginning. Allah's creative power has no limits unless it entails going against His own nature. Now, what view here, which of the views, like answers here, chips away more at those two principles, I personally will be very, very wary of. Anything that seems to be giving up Allah's sovereignty and His uniqueness. Yeah, His uniqueness, His independent, His independent ontological existence. So anything that starts to encroach on those two things, I would find that kind of account problematic. But I can't say which is absolutely sure, because lots of, there are arguments and counter arguments to each. But I've already said my inclination is towards not wanting to be ontologically heavyweight. I believe the other camp, it leads to those two principles of mine being sort of rattled. Can you see? So that I can only offer that tafsil. I mean, I
suppose in our aqidah, the only issue that brings up
absolutely.
Whether or not it's about the return.
Absolutely.
And we have a fairly agreed upon position among Sunnis about the eternality of Allah's attributes. I think beyond that, we're just philosophizing. But there is a kind of general acceptance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes are eternal, as borne out in the famous creedal text.
Absolutely, I agree with that, but it hasn't played out like that in history amongst theologians. I mean, even Taymiyyah rahimahullah, for example, Shaykhul Islam, he didn't. Yeah, but it doesn't mean he's wrong.
No, it doesn't. You're right. I mean, but that's to do with that. But Taymiyyah rahimahullah, as far as I know, he didn't push his philosophy to a point of denial of the attributes.
But I mean,
did he necessarily? I mean, it's.
But the attributes, the divine attributes, emerge out of the essence.
Mu'tazila are Muslim is because their denial isn't a true denial.
Yeah, true. I agree.
Very much acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think so.
Attributed with this view that they denied Allah's attributes, but they didn't.
That was more polemical, isn't it? That's more pejorative, like the Mu'abtilun and things like that.
I think people need to know that.
Yeah, you're right, Mawlana Shams. You're right. Yeah. Back to the Sifat.
Well, I mean, the Mu'tazila, in a sense, are kind of anti-realist in it, or are making that argument. They're thinking, wait a minute, we don't want to multiply all these eternalities. We just want.
That's what developed hal, isn't it? That's one of the
themselves Ahl Tawheed, that argument. But that move was considered too reductive to think, particularly for the discussion of the Quran, particularly.
Yeah.
Being the kind of central issue there. So, and I think these things do come up if you try, just trying to conceptualize the meaning of Quran, like say I'jaz can come into that as well.
But look what the Ash'ari did though. They brought what I call the facsimile theory. The Quran that you have is not the Quran. That's kalam nafsi. So what in effect then is, what is the kalam nafsi? It's not a material thing. It's eternal, which means obviously it's not spatial temporal. All we've got is a photocopy of the Quran. To put it in a bad way, but but we've got the Quran without a doubt. Of course we've got the Quran, but that landed them in trouble.
Yeah, the kalam nafsi or versions of that kind of argument.
So they threw the whole abstract object into the whole discussion of Quran.
I mean, the Ash'ari was pretty straight up about it. They said it is a makhluk version. It is a created version of the so I don't think there is any.
A created, that's right, a fact, but it's not the. But we can't make an identity statement. That's what the Ash'ari said. You can't say the Mus'haf Sharif is of identity. The Quran, the kalam that is in in Allah Himself, in His own kalam, the internal speech. You can't make an identity statement. Why?
There's correspondence.
That's why I call it facsimile. But you can't make it the law of identity, because if one thing, because when you use the identity as equals as being logical identity, you'd have to say whatever one thing holds on that side, it has to hold on the other. And then you got Imam Isa Nabi Salam say, what if I chucked one of the pages of the Mus'haf Sharif in the fire? Are you dolts, and this is his words, are you dolts going to say Allah's kalam is now extinguished? What he's trying to say was, you can't make that logical identity between the kalam nafsi and the Mus'haf Sharif. Although it's the Quran we have. But that's paradoxical, right?
Philosophically, nobody come after me for this, but philosophically, I don't see a problem with it.
No, I'm not problematizing it. What I'm saying was, we've got these sort of discussions in our theology.
I think it's only problematic when somebody takes the issue of kalam, kalam nafsi and kalam.
Even the kalam nafsi concept itself is disputed, though, isn't it? By the way, because it's based on the Aristotelian idea that language comes from the soul.
Shall I just? I'd like to just, as chair, it's been very interesting to have the kind of conversation. Are there other questions or comments that anyone else wants to make? We can carry on if not. But No. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of the hadith about Allah has 100 parts of mercy, would you take that as literal, and how would you fit that into mercy being like a concept, for example, in the realist or anti-realist? Like if it's a possession, then is it still an abstract?
I mean, this goes back to how the Arabs use their language.
Yeah, I don't
So,
know the Arabic, so.
So how do the Arabs use their language? So we would have to go to the specialists of how, when they talk about how Allah's attribute being divided in 99. This is how I understand the Arabic language. It's very simple. We have experts here in the Arabic language. We've got Mona Shams. We've got experts, so you can refer to them. For me, if the scholars of language say the Arabic language reduces to four words. Arabic language reduced to four categories. You've got the haqiqi, the literal, the majaz, the non-literal, what we call the figurative. You got the mushtaq, the Arabic word that's derived from a pattern or a stencil from the Arabic language, and a word that is mu'arrab or Arabized. These are generally the four types of words in the Arabic language. So if we take it on a haqiqi meaning, literal meaning, according to the Arabic language and the usloob of the Arabs, the style of the Arabs, is it theologically problematic? If it's not, then we take it. But if there is a qarina or a reason, a contextual indication to depart from the literal, then we go to a figurative meaning established in the language. It can't be someone concocted it, or we look at a modern usage. It has to be based on whichever grammarian's view you take, maybe up to the first 400 years. When al-lugha al-fusha is supposed to have disappeared, or if you even take maybe the 5th century. So we have to go to see how the Arabs use their language. So we have to see how the words have been codified in the lexicons. So if literally taking it is fine, then we take it. If it needs a metaphorical, figurative reading, then we need an indication to tell us to take a non-literal reading. I don't know. I'm not well versed in the the sort of interpretive discussions about that hadith. So, like I said, but that goes back to my point. When I talk about Allah's attributes, that attribute of rahmah being divided up, I don't want to make the metaphysical assent of a composition of that divine attribute. But you can only do that on an anti-realist view. Can you see? Yeah, no, absolutely. There's so much work to do if those who are interested in that kind of stuff. But my understanding is, you must take, the language, haqiqi, unless there's a reason that you must depart from the haqiqi to a majazi reading. Allah knows best. Allah knows best. We've got experts.
Can I just say that I think what is highlighted, which Muslims nowadays generally overlook, and I think it's important for Tulab al-Ilm as well to take on board, is the importance of language, the importance of linguistics. And I think people do a lot of studying here, there, and everywhere, and they do bits and bobs of different things, and there's often a kind of undervaluing of the centrality of language, to everything, pretty much.
Well, look,
The whole deen is about. We receive the Quran before anything else. I mean, after the Prophet sallallahu
alayhi salatu wasalam,
and even the word of the Prophet
sallallahu alayhi wa sallam,
as language, and our ability to engage with it is entirely to the measure of our language.
Yeah, I mean, look, anyone who's, look, the very challenge primarily defined that Allah mentions in the Quran is a linguistic challenge. But yet, as a community, I just feel we don't care about language. I find that very shocking. And then people scratch their heads. Obviously, there are other ways people are framing i'jaz, like in terms of a contextual framing of i'jaz. It could be related to the comprehensive package of guidance that might define I'm not going down that. But primarily, the self-descriptive challenge is linguistic. That's the way Allah has described the challenge primarily. But why don't I feel exasperated why we don't care about language? Yet we're staking the veracity of the Prophet alayhi afdalu salatu wa taslim on a linguistic miracle, and yet we've got to know something about words. The Arabs are alright, they were connoisseurs of language. I mean, they knew how lugha worked and things like that. It may have been codified later and a taxonomy and all that, but I find it astonishing that we don't care about literature, or we don't care about how what's behind language and words. I find that astonishing. I really do, and I don't know. I'm stumped for words. Yeah. So
I could offer some words.
Oh, please.
Ebrahim College's Arabic weighted program as a product of it. It's a must, I believe.
Allah yuwaffiqukum. Allah yuwaffiqukum jami'an.
Because language is so important, and I mean, as a student and as a teacher, I'll be honest, it's a real shame. I think that the downfall of the Muslim Ummah goes hand in hand with the downfall of our understanding of the Arabic language. So
yeah, revival linked to language, definitely. I agree.
Nice plug.
Oh, yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Anything that's been left? Someone wants to say, please do ask, or if you've got a comment to make of your own, it's absolutely fine. If not, I think we'll draw the session to
Thank you.
close.
Yeah.
So Dr. Safaruk has offered to email the paper. I think the easiest thing, because I think it's not everyone's necessarily going to read the paper. If you are interested, I'm sure. Can you just give us?
Yeah. So I just all right. So I'll write up here. No, it's not. I'll say it out. It's quite easy.
Say it out, yeah.
Yeah, it's SAF dot Chowdhury CHOWDHURY. So just sort of first name dot surname. So SAF dot Chowdhury CHOWDHURY at gmail.com. Yeah, so if anyone wants to read it, it's saf.chowdhury at gmail.com.